Okay, everyone. Um, I hope that you can hear me. I have no way of knowing really, but I wanted to thank everyone for being here. I want to acknowledge that these are really challenging times for nearly everyone right now. And I hope that you're all healthy and safe and secure wherever you may be. And hopefully this is an opportunity to put your mind and your energy somewhere else for a little while. I know that Kevin and I are excited to be doing this. Just a couple little items of housekeeping. Um, if possible, if you have short questions to ask via the chat box, that's best. And you can actually toggle to choose to send your messages to all panelists and attendees, and that allows everyone to see rather than just Kevin and myself. We are going to have a more robust Q&A at the end of the webinar. So if you have larger or more overarching questions there or thoughts, that is a good place for that. And at that point, along with chat questions, you will also be able to use the raise your hand feature. And I can go ahead and unmute you and you can share a question or some thoughts. If you're having difficulty with any of that, just send a message in the chat and I will try to help troubleshoot, although Zoom can be a little tricky. Just a couple other things. This webinar is not a referendum on hunters or hunting. We touch on hunting a lot in the presentation, but there are other forums if you want to have that specific discussion. And then moving forward throughout the webinar, both Kevin and I will use the word hunting as kind of shorthand to refer to hunting, fishing, and trapping. And then finally, I'd like to say that this is part of a series we're doing on wildlife governance reform. So if you have any feedback or topics or panelists you'd like to suggest, I am all ears. And my email is at the last slide, and I welcome any of that information. And on we go. My name is Chris Smith. I work for WildEarth Guardians. We are a conservation nonprofit that protects and restores the wildlife, wild places, wild rivers, and health of the American West. I'm based in my home state of New Mexico, where I work on our wildlife policy and advocacy here in the Southern Rockies region, and also some of our neighboring states, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, to some extent. And you can engage with Guardians online via any of these social media platforms, or again, my email is listed at the end of the slideshow. And I'd like to welcome Kevin Bixby from the Southwest Environmental Center.
Thanks, Chris. Hello, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. I'm excited to be co-hosting this webinar. This is actually the first webinar I've ever presented, so hey, excited about that. Some of you know me, some of you don't. I am the executive director of the Southwest Environmental Center. We are a wildlife advocacy organization based in Las Cruces, New Mexico. We work to protect and restore native wildlife and their habitats in the Southwest. Yeah, welcome.
Great. So I'm just going to give us a quick roadmap where we're going to go in this webinar, so we're not flying blind. First, we're going to discuss what the North American model of wildlife conservation is, why it is important, some of its successes, some of its problems. Then we're going to have a kind of a broader discussion about whether it is still relevant and useful and what the future of wildlife conservation might look like in these terms. So with that, Kevin is going to go ahead and tell us what the North American model of wildlife conservation is.
Yeah, and I know there are folks on this webinar who are very familiar with the model and have written about it and probably know more than Chris or I. Please, if we say something that's incorrect, correct us and offer your insights that we may omit. And some of you I know will probably have never heard of the North American model. And if we were doing this live and you're in front of me in a room, I would ask you to hold up your hands. How many people have heard of the model. But it's a pretty significant thing in wildlife management in the United States, particularly at the state level, which is where a lot of very important decisions about wildlife conservation are made. So what is this North American model? Well, it's a little confusing about what it actually is. It's either a historical account of how the history of wildlife conservation in North America since about 1880, the late 1800s to the present, and maybe both, it is a prescriptive model for how wildlife ought to be managed going forward. And the original framers, mostly in their original articulation of the model in written form, mostly were describing a historical account of wildlife conservation. But that narrative has been embraced and used to advocate for a certain way of managing wildlife going forward. So we have to look at both aspects of the model. There is no official version, nor no official keeper of the model. Probably the closest thing is an organization called the Wildlife Society, and it's a professional organization of wildlife managers. And in 2012, they came up with this definition, that it is a set of principles that collectively applied has led to the form, function, and successes of wildlife conservation and management in the US and Canada. So the origins, the first full formal articulation in writing was in 2001 in a publication called The Transactions of the North American Wildlife and Natural Resources Conference. It was an article entitled "Why Hunting Has Defined the North American Model of Wildlife Conservation." And the authors were three men. The lead author was Valerius Geist at the University of Calgary. Other authors were Shane Mahoney with the Newfoundland and Labrador Wildlife Division, and John Organ with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And I've noted there that all three men were hunters, are hunters, and that will be, the relevance of that will become clear later. So the lead author is often considered the father of the North American model, Valerius Geist, biologist, born in Ukraine, 1938, raised in Germany. And he thinks very highly of this model. And here's just a sample quote from one of his publications. "It is probably the greatest environmental achievement of the 20th century, and maybe one of the greatest achievements of North American culture." So it's pretty high praise. On other matters, on biodiversity, on carnivore conservation, he's, I would say, old school. Here's something he had to say recently about wolves. "I am here to tell you why the wolf does not belong in settled landscapes. Wolves do unbelievable damage to wildlife. They do great damage to agriculture. They pose a real threat to public health and safety, and they kill humans under now well-known circumstances." And these were remarks he gave at a Big Game Forever banquet and wolf symposium in 2018. If you don't know, Big Game Forever is a vehemently anti-wolf organization. So sort of the origin story of the North American model is basically game animals were pushed to the brink of extinction at the end of the 19th century due to unregulated market and subsistence hunting, or pot hunting, as it was called sort of derogatively. And then gentleman sport hunters who hunted for recreation, not for necessarily for out of necessity, like Teddy Roosevelt, pushed for regulations that saved game species. Sport hunters later paid for the recovery of wildlife by purchasing hunting licenses that funded game departments. And later still, with taxes that they paid on guns, on the purchase of guns, ammo, and ammunition and fishing tackle. And the idea is that this is a unique system that evolved in North America, sort of a form of North American exceptionalism. So as originally articulated, the model had four principles, also often referred to as pillars, and they are listed on the left of your screen. And then on the right, I've listed, fleshed them out in terms of the fuller interpretation, including the sort of normative guidelines that have been derived from each of the principles, either articulated by the original framers or by subsequent promoters of the model. So the first is that wildlife is a public trust resource. And what that means is wildlife has value to all people, should be conserved through public ownership, not private, with the government acting as the trustee of that public resource. Second is that elimination of markets for wildlife. And the prescription that follows is that commercialized use of wildlife should be prohibited. The third principle is that wildlife allocation should be by law. In other words, the permission to take wildlife for consumption should be granted according to regulations established with public input that apply equally to everyone. So you don't have because you own land or you have wealth, you don't get a privileged opportunity to shoot a deer, for example. Number four, wildlife can only be killed for a legitimate purpose. And what that means is anyone's guess. It's subject to widely different interpretation. In that 2001 article, the original articulation, the framers basically said that what that means is you can kill wildlife for food, fur, self-defense, or property protection. Those are legitimate uses. The fifth principle is that wildlife are considered an international resource, which means that wildlife that cross national boundaries should be managed cooperatively by nations. The sixth is that science is the proper tool for discharge of wildlife policy, meaning science should be the determining factor in allocating uses of wildlife, sorry. And finally, the last principle is that democracy of hunting, all citizens should have the right and opportunity to hunt.
Thanks, Kevin. So I want to talk about why this set of principles is important for on-the-ground wildlife management and conservation, because the North American model is not a law. It doesn't have tested and direct legal authority in almost all cases. And yet I would argue it's baked into the cake of wildlife policy throughout the United States and Canada. So I think it's pretty ubiquitous. And the reasons are that it is held aloft by wildlife management agencies. It's in some of the curricula of natural resource schools, and many policy influencers subscribe to the tenets of the model. So if this is wildlife policy, which is not often this pretty or tasty, these are some of the factors that go into it. And I think most people would assume and hope that science and public input or public values would go into any kind of policymaking in the natural resource field. And then those of us who have worked in policy advocacy and specifically wildlife policy advocacy won't be surprised to see that money and politics, of course, play a pretty prevalent role. But the North American model is kind of the fifth pillar, if you will. It's baked into the cake in many ways and influences policies throughout. So federal agencies subscribe to the North American model, both explicitly and implicitly. This is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the kind of big U.S. federal agency in charge of wildlife management, touting the virtues of the North American model on their website. State agencies, to a single one, all 50 of the U.S. state wildlife agencies and the Washington, D.C. Wildlife Agency are members of the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, or AFWA, which is this big conglomeration. When you go to the AFWA website and you click on AFWA is, one of the first things that comes up is the North American model of wildlife conservation. And then of course we see it throughout individual states. So here's the director of the New Mexico Department of Game and Fish touting the North American model in a publication. Here's another New Mexico story from the Department of Game and Fish talking about this is what the North American model for wildlife conservation was designed to do. So this bighorn sheep that has been killed by this hunter is a North American model success story. Here's an Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife budgetary request memo, wherein they say that the wildlife management program is the primary vehicle for implementation of the North American model wildlife management. Here's California, similarly identifying the model as one of the forefronts of their unique strategy for wildlife conservation. Here's Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife noting that these 7 principles of the model govern the actions of regulatory agencies like Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. Here's Colorado Parks and Wildlife identifying the North American model as one of their guiding principles and influencing factors. And I could go on and list all 50 states and find something on their websites that allude to their subscription to the model. Policy influencers also subscribe to the model. So there's a lot of people trying to influence policy in the world of wildlife. Kevin is one person, I'm one person, and I suspect most of the people on this webinar are as well. But some of the bigger influencers specifically and explicitly subscribe to the model. So this is taken from the Wildlife Society, and this was actually posted just a few weeks ago. But not only does the Wildlife Society view itself as promoting the model, they go so far as to say that they support the identification of threats and challenges to the viability and application of the model and work to deter those threats. So they're saying, not only is this our platform, but if it comes under threat, we're going to ensure that that threat is deterred. This is the National Wildlife Federation, arguably, I think, one of the biggest players in wildlife policy in the US, and they also tout the model. They, I think, are inclined to create space for a critique of it a little more than some, but I would say that they're proponents of it at large. And I could, again, find a lot of examples of this, and a couple will come up later in the webinar. And then finally, natural resource schools, which are kind of the training ground for most wildlife managers who work at federal or state agencies. They'll go through a graduate program usually at a natural resource school. And if you survey the curricula of those graduate programs, you will often find classes on, or at least lectures on, the North American model. So this class, I just picked a random one from University of Arkansas. On the first day of class, they talk about the North American model. So again, the model doesn't have direct legal authority necessarily, but it's baked into all these different layers of determining factors of wildlife policy. And we're going to talk about some of the problems and challenges with the model for sure, but I did want to create space to identify some of the successes of the North American model. I'm sure others would find more than the ones I've listed, but we have limited time. So again, wildlife is a public asset. There's species conservation that has come out of the North American model. And then historically, though not one of the tenets of the model has indirectly supported a viable and sustainable source of funding for state wildlife agencies. So this is a pretty grisly and iconic photograph of bison skulls in the late 19th century. And this was the type of waste and wanton killing that the model set out to kind of end. And in some ways it's been successful in that. So wildlife as a public trust resource, this means that nobody owns wildlife. And I personally don't know how you could own wildlife, but that word is bantered about quite a bit. Wildlife is not commercialized for private gain, at least in theory. And I put a big asterisk up there for some issues that we'll talk about later. But in theory, wildlife is not something that a private person can make money off of. And then finally, wildlife policy should be democratic. Again, at least in theory, every American should have equal say in how wildlife is managed at the federal level, and likewise at the state level, every citizen of a state should have say in how that wildlife is managed. So this photograph here of sandhill cranes at the Bosque del Apache in New Mexico, I think is kind of a nice articulation of that. These birds are there for everyone to enjoy, and everyone, at least in theory, gets a say in how these birds are conserved and managed. Species conservation. This picture here are desert bighorn sheep in New Mexico, which were on the brink of extinction. And again, thanks to some of the tenets of the model and investment, both directly and indirectly from hunters, a lot of species have been brought back from the brink of extinction. Now, desert bighorn are still struggling and they're nowhere near their historical abundance, but there are desert bighorn. And I think people could make the argument that that wouldn't be the case without this model being in place. The caveat to this success, which I think most people on this call will know, is that a lot of species conservation is heavily, heavily slanted towards game species, which hunters pursue. And that's why there's been an investment in those species, whereas species like invertebrates or especially native carnivores have not fared so well under this model. And then finally, funding, which I gave a webinar about a few weeks ago, both through hunting and fishing license sales and programs like the Pittman-Robertson Act. Hunters and anglers fund directly and indirectly state wildlife agencies, and that has historically been stable and fairly bountiful. The paradigm is shifting because hunters nationwide are declining, and so this funding source is going to dry up and is already becoming unstable. But at least historically, I would argue this was one of the successes stemming from the North American model. And with that, Kevin is going to talk about just some of the problems with the model.
Okay, starting with the model as a historical accounting of wildlife conservation. The basic problem is it's an incomplete story. Yes, there have been successes. Yes, some species, primarily game species, have been saved from extinction. But the model and the proponents of the model really overstate the recovery successes. If you compare the numbers of game animals, say going back to 1870 as using that as a benchmark year, today their numbers are vastly reduced. Pronghorn are maybe 2% of historic levels. Bison, just a blip of what they used to be. Bighorn sheep, less than 5%. So, recovery has been, of course, a lot of habitat's been lost, but still there's a lot of room for additional recovery that has not happened. The model and the model proponents are silent on the failures. So if you're going to claim, if you're going to attribute the model, if you're going to attribute successes to the model, you also have to take responsibility for failures, I believe. And some of those failures are, most of our big predators were eradicated, like wolves and grizzly bears and jaguars and mountain lions in the eastern part of the country anyway. And as Chris alluded to, there continues to be sort of institutional hostility towards predators on the part of state wildlife agencies. There's also endangered species. We have approximately 500 vertebrate species in the US that are threatened, vulnerable. And that list continues to grow. And that's all indicative of something that's happening worldwide, which is the sixth mass extinction, where we are losing species and ecosystems at an accelerating rate. So this has all happened while the model in the United States or Canada was in action, so to speak. Also, the story ignores the contributions of non-hunters. And since most hunters historically and currently are white and male, the story embodied in the model ignores the contributions of women and non-whites. And some examples are the Audubon Society, which in the early years was mostly led by women, was very instrumental in some of our most important wildlife conservation victories early on. There were non-hunter leaders in the conservation movement over the years, John Muir, Rachel Carson, examples. And then the whole environmental movement of the 70s was not something that was led by hunters. And that resulted in the endangered, some really important laws that have been extremely important in wildlife protection, such as the Endangered Species Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, and others. And then finally, and I noticed that Don Mold is on the call. He's written an excellent article about this. The model is really silent on the role of public lands and the contribution of particularly federal public lands to wildlife conservation. It's probably arguably the most important thing that we've done in this country towards wildlife conservation is to set aside areas as public lands. And those were paid for, the acquisition and the management, paid for largely by taxpayers like you and I, not hunters. So those are some of the ways that the story is incomplete. Now, if you look at the model as prescriptive, in other words, a guide for how we ought to manage wildlife, there are problems with that as well. First of all, it prioritizes game species, a subset of all wildlife, and it prioritizes hunting and hunters, which is a subset of uses of wildlife and users of wildlife. One problem with that is that the interests of hunters are not always aligned with conservation. And there's lots of examples of that. The controversy over using lead bullets, which leads to secondary poisoning of wild animals, such as vultures and condors. The whole controversy over predators. A lot of hunters are opposed to predators and want to get rid of them. The introduction of non-native species for the benefit of hunters. And here in New Mexico, we have oryx walking across southern New Mexico, which are not native to even North America. And then every year, our Game and Fish Department raises and releases millions of non-native rainbow trout into our waterways that compete with our native fishes, including our native trout. So these are just some of the examples of how the interests of hunters are not necessarily aligned with conservation. And also the model ignores the other ways of valuing and using wildlife, using in quotes. It really has a very resource-focused perspective, which really ignores the possibility that wild animals have intrinsic value apart from their utility to humans. It really doesn't have an ecological perspective in which every species is valued because it contributes to the functioning of ecosystems. It really ignores the other uses of wildlife besides consumptive uses, such as wildlife viewing and bird watching. And it's at odds with indigenous views of wildlife, which really don't see animals as resources at all, but as people and as members of a living community. And to that, related to that is that I would say, and others have said this, that the model reflects an ideology of dominance and exploitation, which some have called a settler colonialism. And if you want to read more about that, I recommend this article that's on the screen, Hunting for Justice, an Indigenous Critique of the North American Model of Wildlife Conservation. Continuing with problems with the prescriptive model, looking at specific tenets, the one that says wildlife can only be killed for a legitimate purpose, well, that just begs the question, what is a legitimate purpose and who gets to decide? Now, a lot of activities that most people would find illegitimate are allowed by states. They're legal. They may even be encouraged. And these include things like wildlife killing contest, prairie dog shoots where people just shoot prairie dogs for fun, trophy hunting, and etc. And then if you look at the tenet that says science is the proper tool for discharge of wildlife policy, well, that sort of assumes that decisions can be made in a value neutral context. And I and other critics disagree. That's just not possible. And I and others believe that wildlife decisions about how to manage wildlife are fundamentally political and involve values. And science can inform those decisions, but science does not necessarily tell us how to make those decisions. And just to give one example, science can tell us how many adult female mountain lions we can remove from a population before the population starts to decline, okay? But science can't tell us if we should be removing mountain lions from a population at all, if we should allow hunting of mountain lions. That's just one example. That's a value decision. Also, I think it's a logical fallacy to jump from a description of what happened in the past, and there were some successes, ergo, we should continue doing the same thing going forward. I don't think that's, I think wildlife conservation is a complicated endeavor, and a simple model that worked in the past sometimes is not going to be adequate going forward. And then the model has been inconsistently applied. Chris is going to talk about trapping, but the prohibition on commercialization of wildlife, well, we have commercial fisheries, for example, we harvest large amounts of fish out of the ocean, and that is a commercialization of wildlife. And the hunting outfitting industry has captured and privatized the economic benefits of wildlife. Essentially, it makes outfitters can make a lot of money, and the same with private land tags, et cetera. So the model has not been consistently applied.
So Kevin made the mistake of mentioning trapping, which means Chris gets to get on his soapbox. Trapping, I think, is one of the most interesting inconsistencies within the North American model to me, not just because I staunchly oppose trapping, but because I think it points to kind of a larger set of convenient exemptions within the model that are kind of, again, baked in to allow for certain things that don't actually fit. And that makes me question the value of the model as a whole, notwithstanding some of the successes I pointed out earlier. So recreational or commercial trapping is legal and even encouraged in most of the United States. And it's allowed and I guess encouraged by state wildlife agencies, including our Game and Fish Department here in New Mexico, which has stickers encouraging people to take their children trapping. And those state wildlife agencies profess to adhere to the North American model. And I just want to acknowledge really quickly this coyote here in a trap was a photograph taken here in New Mexico by the only participant of this webinar who cannot see it right now, Mary Catherine Ray, who is joining us on the phone. And Mary Catherine, if you would like to chime in, I'm gonna unmute you for the next couple minutes, not to put you on the spot. So I have pulled these two tenets or sisters of the North American model from the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation. And I could have found them anywhere, similar language at different places. As Kevin alluded to, there's no canonical or orthodox set of tenets, but that's where I got these. And so tenet 2 says that commercial hunting and the sale of wildlife is prohibited to ensure the sustainability of wildlife populations. And tenet 5 says that in North America, individuals may legally kill certain wild animals under strict guidelines for food and fur, self-defense, and property protection, whereas they should not be killed merely for antlers, horns, or feathers. So I want to examine that second tenet first, which is the prohibition on the commerce of dead wildlife. And I cannot think of a more clear example of commercializing dead wildlife than a fur auction after a trapping season. So I apologize for this image, but these are all coyote pelts waiting to be auctioned off after trapping season here in North America, where the model purports to prohibit the commercialization of wildlife. And then in terms of the fifth tenet, I find this one really interesting. I don't purport to be a very deep thinker, but if I was to see one bucket that was labeled self-defense, food, etc., and another bucket that was labeled antlers, horns, feathers, etc., and one bucket it was okay to put things in, and the other it wasn't, and I was deciding where to put fur in terms of these two buckets, it would be a pretty easy decision for me. The human brain is really, really good at categorizing things, and I think fur is a lot more like antlers, horns, and feathers than it is self-defense or food. And maybe my calculus would be different if it were 1850, but it's not 1850 anymore. But wouldn't you know it, the North American model places fur in the self-defense and food bucket, which just utterly blows my mind. So I'm gonna stop ranting about trapping for a minute, but I just wanna note that, to be clear, there are a lot of other really good reasons to be opposed to trapping, and I'm happy to talk to you for hours about them. Our coalition here in New Mexico is called Trap Free New Mexico, and you are welcome to engage us at any time, and I'm thrilled if you do. And I do, again, want to make space for Mary Catherine to add anything before we depart from trapping, if she would like.
Oh, hey, I don't know if you can hear me, but thank you.
We can.
As I'm listening, and having read many trapping forums, I think maybe this whole model needs a better definition of wildlife. That there are a lot of people who don't even think of coyotes as being wildlife. They fit in some other category, and I guess that you're right. What you've said is pretty shocking when you lay it out this way, that this broad category of animals, from foxes to bobcats to even little tiny ringtails and weasels, can be exploited in this way. And yet the agencies still purport to follow the North American model. It is just pretty shocking. And anyway, thank you for talking about it.
Yeah, thanks, Mary Catherine, and I'm really glad you were able to join. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Kevin, because he's not done discussing the problems yet.
Yeah, I think we really need to look, whatever the intentions of the original framers in articulating what the model is, it has definitely been embraced and used in an ideological way since it was originally articulated. And I think to understand that, we need to look at the central role of hunting and hunters in the model and in its promotion. So I mentioned that the three authors of that original written articulation were all hunters, avid hunters, I would say. And this is not an anti-hunting screed. I'm not personally not opposed to hunting for meat, but that's not the issue. The issue is the power, who has power in the decision-making over how wildlife should be managed. So 4 of the 7 pillars in the model refer to hunting. So it's already, very hunting focused. And then the framers themselves, in addition to the original publication, which was entitled Why Hunting Has Defined the North American Model, have written many other publications, and I listed a couple others there. Born in the Hands of Hunters, Enshrining Hunting as a Foundation for Conservation. You can see where their heads are at, what they're thinking. They obviously think that hunters and hunting have a very central role to play in wildlife conservation. And that has been, that view has been widely promoted by state wildlife agencies and hunting-focused organizations like the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, as Chris mentioned earlier. Next slide. And this is, I think, a pretty telling example. This is from the website of the Arizona Game and Fish Department. And they, like most state wildlife agencies, they promote the North American model on their websites. They talk about hunting and angling being the cornerstones. But then it's interesting here, they list the 7 tenets of the North American model, but they have substituted one. They've replaced one with one of their liking, better. And that one is the one that's circled there. Hunters and anglers fund conservation. Now this was not in that original article that articulated the model. This has been substituted. And if you're scratching your head trying to remember which one was replaced, it was the one that said wildlife should not be killed for frivolous reasons. And I suspect that one is just a little too uncomfortable for the wildlife management community to get behind. And this one is more to their liking. And clearly, this one is self-serving with respect to the hunting community and hunting itself. So it's really remarkable that in the short period of time, less than 20 years since the model appeared in print and was articulated in print for the first time by, sorry, my dog is barking, by Geist et al. It's been so broadly and widely disseminated and promoted and embraced. And these promotional efforts collectively have been described by critics of the model as representing perhaps the most widely disseminated, unified, and concerted messaging ever undertaken to convey a specific and narrow aspect of wildlife conservation in North America. And I would say that that essentially is propaganda. Next slide. Now, what else was going on when the model was first articulated in subsequent years? Well, I imagine that for one thing, demographically, the number of hunters was declining. And what that meant is that state wildlife agencies were seeing a reduction in their revenues because state wildlife agencies rely in large part, as Chris mentioned earlier, on revenues that come from hunters, either directly or indirectly. And so the reduction in the number of hunters is an existential threat to the budgets of these agencies. At the same time, we began to see the passage of what are called right to hunt laws in various states that sort of institutionalize the right of people to hunt and fish, and in some cases enshrine in law, or in some cases it's a constitutional amendment, enshrine hunting and fishing and trapping as the highest priorities for wildlife management in those states. And excluding Vermont, which is an extreme outlier in this list, the first right to hunt law was passed in Alabama, and then others followed suit. And this is about the time when the model was being articulated and being embraced by state wildlife management agencies. And I don't think that's a coincidence. And then if you spend any time on hunting forums like I do, you will pretty quickly encounter descriptions of people that broach any sort of criticism of wildlife management as an attack on hunting. And the model proponents are of that view, that I think that the antis, as they say, are a threat to hunting and the model. And this is an example. This is from a technical review of the North American model that appeared in the Wildlife Society publication, authored by some of the original framers of the model, as well as members of the Wildlife Society. Persons who accept an animal rights worldview categorically reject the concept of ownership of animals, rendering the central legal principles of the public trust doctrine irrelevant. Now, I disagree with that statement. I don't think it's correct. But what's most important here is that strong leadership and concerted efforts on the part of wildlife professionals will be required to make the case that wild places are important and that wildlife needs to be protected for one and all, as posited by the public trust doctrine. Well, the contradiction in that statement, of course, is that one and all excludes anyone with an animal rights perspective. So, yeah, you can see the defensiveness and the value of the model for proponents in defending the status quo. Next slide. So, I'm not a scholar. I haven't spent years studying the North American model, but my conclusion is that it is an incomplete framing of history that served to justify and perpetuate a system of wildlife management that privileges game hunting and hunters, administered by state agencies that are funded in large part by hunters, resulting in the marginalization and exclusion of other stakeholders and legitimate public interest in wildlife. So I think particularly for the wildlife advocates who are on the call, I think this is my takeaway, my most important takeaway message is that the model is not our friend. The model is used to prop up a system that doesn't want to hear other points of view, other ways of valuing wildlife. Now, the public trust doctrine I would submit, is a good thing. It's a democratic and progressive legal and ethical framework for wildlife conservation. And it is in the North American model. It's the first tenet. But the way it's interpreted by the model and model proponents is different than others have interpreted it. And I just want to point out some of the differences. As used in the model, wildlife is a public resource to be used. In a broader public interest view, wildlife is a public good that may or may not be used by humans. And it is open to the possibility that wild animals have intrinsic value apart from their value to people. As used in the model, hunters are the privileged beneficiaries of the trust in wildlife. Under a broader public interest view, all legal public interest in wildlife are recognized, and if those interests are competing, they're adjudicated by the trustee. As used in the model, changes in societal values are a threat to the trust. Under a broader view, changes in those values are expected and accommodated. As used in the model, the trustee is aligned. The trustee, in other words, state wildlife agencies, is aligned with a particular beneficiary, hunters, and use of wildlife hunting. And in a broader view, that's not the case. So those are important differences. So I'm going to turn it back to Chris.
Thanks, Kevin. So I'm going to kind of prompt this next part, which is we're going to open it up for questions and discussion pretty shortly. But I want to think about kind of the moment we're living in as it pertains to conservation and specifically wildlife conservation. And I just sat down for a couple minutes, and these are some of the things that I thought about that impact the kind of applicability of any wildlife model, but things that we have to grapple with now as wildlife advocates or people who otherwise care about wildlife, whether you're a hunter or anything. You know, it's 2020 and a lot has changed, a lot is changing, and a lot will continue to change. And some of these things we may perceive as good or bad. Some of them we may resist or try to control, and some of them are way out of our hands or inevitable. And the question that I want us to ask collectively is whether the North American model, either in theory or applied, is something that has the flexibility to continue to be useful. You know, can it evolve? Can it be adequately interpreted in a flexible manner? Or do we need to see a fundamental shift? Is there a new model that we can think of and apply? Or is it worth even considering a single model of wildlife conservation in our current paradigm? And so Kevin is going to share a couple thoughts, but then that's where I'd love the discussion to go if you all stick around.
Yeah, and thank you, Chris. I don't know if there's, you know, one, I don't know if any model particularly is going to be adequate. I mean, wildlife conservation is hugely challenging. And the field of conservation biology emerged as sort of an alternative to traditional wildlife management, and had a much more goal-oriented focus, much more focused on preserving all species, biodiversity, systems, and recognizing that it was a very challenging endeavor and everyone needed to be involved. I'll let you read this at your leisure. I don't want to take the time to read it now, but this is just like one of many possible lists of guiding principles for a future wildlife conservation. Next slide. And this is something that after Southwest Environmental Center, we hosted Kirk's group, we hosted a conference in Albuquerque in 2018 called Wildlife for All, looking at state wildlife governance. And after that, we attempted at our organization to draft a set of, you know, principles that we'd like to see used for wildlife conservation going forward. And again, this is on our website, on the Southwest Environmental Center website. The URL is at the bottom there. I'm not going to take time to read it, but you know, I think this is still a work in progress, and we need to figure it out. But I think bottom line is the North American model, as currently promoted, is not up to the task of saving the planet, saving life on the planet.
Thanks. So I wanted to open it up to questions and discussion here. Thank you all for joining. My email address and Kevin's email address are at the bottom of this slide. There's a lot of ways to get involved. Kevin is going to talk about a couple. I know it's a hard time for everyone. It's a hard time for conservation nonprofits, certainly. So if you feel like contributing to either of our organizations, that is welcome. And then just before Kevin has the last word, quick reminder to either type questions into the chat or use the raise your hand function, and I will unmute you if you have something longer to say. And again, thank you all.
Thanks, Chris. Very quickly, I would just urge everybody to, probably the most important thing you can do is to show up and to participate in state wildlife decision-making, attend Game Commission meetings, speak up, show by your presence and your words that wildlife conservation is not the exclusive purview of hunters. There's a broader public interest at stake. You're interested, and they should listen to your views. If they're truly going to be the trustees of the public trust.
Yeah, and I just put in the link in the chat, sorry, a link to sign up for some of our efforts here in the Western states, or to get you involved if you're working in a state where we don't work, and I will type that here again. And now I'm gonna start reading off questions, and again, raise your hand if you have something longer to say. So here's one: how do you define conservation? Kevin, do you wanna take a stab at that? Or again, anyone can raise their hand.
Well, that's a very long answer. I don't think we have time on this webinar.
That is a good question, but might be too long. Here's one from Donna Casano. How do you respond to the argument that hunters and fishers finance state wildlife agencies, and without them, there would be no money for conservation? Can you speak about other funding options?
You want to take a stab at that, Chris?
Yeah, thank you, Donna. You know, I think that argument has been pushed for years and years and years and has largely been true. And now with the decline in hunting nationwide, we're seeing that the power to uphold that argument is waning naturally. And while hunters and wildlife agencies are trying to recruit and retain hunters, there is a movement, including myself and Kevin and other people at the state level, to get state legislatures and wildlife agencies to start looking for other funding sources. That's borne fruit in a couple of places, and it's nascent in a couple of places. But for example, Kevin's senator here in New Mexico, state senator, pushed forward a bill to seek alternative funding in this last legislative session, and that bill didn't pass, but we're gonna continue to work behind the scenes to make sure that things like that gain momentum, and so new funding sources become a reality, which ultimately will change the perceived stakeholders of state wildlife agencies. So it's a really good question without a really good answer, but suffice to say, people are working on it. Okay, a lot of questions coming in here. This is from Samantha Bruger. With influencers in positions of power, isn't that the fox guarding the hen house? How do we get more animal-friendly folks appointed? Kevin, do you want to take that?
Yeah, these are all great questions. We've been working on solving them. Our coalition of groups here in New Mexico. Yeah, you know, I think the fundamental problem, so in New Mexico, we recently elected a pretty progressive governor, Michelle Lujan Grisham. And we had high hopes, and in our state, as in most states, our game commission is appointed by the governor. What we're up against is traditionally those seats, those appointments have been made by the governor to reward their, you know, campaign contributors, because, you know, that was a good place to put them, and reserved for hunters and anglers. And we had high hopes that our new governor would break that pattern, but she did not. Every member of our new game commission, she did replace all the game commissioners, but they're all hunters. You know, breaking through the idea that wildlife is the exclusive province of people that consume wildlife, that's a fundamental challenge that we have to overcome. And we just have to, you know, as I said earlier, we have to keep showing up, and we have to cultivate our champions in the legislatures, and we need to communicate to all our elected officials. And I also think the secret there is making alliances outside of the conservation community to link wildlife governance to a broader social justice platform agenda, because it's all about power, and that's fundamental. That's what's at the root of many of these justice issues, is who has the power and who's excluded. And that's the way we need to start talking about wildlife issues, in my opinion.
Yeah, I want to note that there's a lot of not just questions, but helpful tips and comments and resources in the chat. I don't think I can read them all. Here's a question that I can't spend a lot of time on. I've only been to India very briefly, but have you considered how wildlife is managed in other countries? I'm amazed how people in India tolerate large carnivores. I don't know how something like that fits or could be applied here. That question's from Helen McGinnis, but I would be very curious to know. And actually, my sister lived in India for a long time. I will see if she has any insight. Kevin, any thoughts on that?
No.
All right, it's a good question. I suspect it goes back to kind of our recent American history of settling and de-wilding Western landscapes for the sake of agriculture. But I will certainly look into that.
Well, I do have one thing to add to that quickly. In New Mexico, I'm working with a guy named Subankar Banerjee, and maybe some of you have heard of him. He actually is a professor in the art and ecology department at the University of New Mexico, and he is a very knowledgeable and outspoken on the need to, save biodiversity around the world. And he's got a global perspective, and he's from India. And I don't know the details because I've never really discussed with him how it's done in India, but he has made reference to the fact that many countries around the world have national biodiversity conservation plans. The United States does not. But that's all I can say about India.
Here's a question for you, Kevin, from Pamela. Given your assertion that management decisions cannot be made in a value-neutral context, where do we go from there? Since the advocacy voice is not welcomed by management agencies, what do you suggest?
Well, that's a great question, but too bad. Make them hear you. You have a right to voice your opinions, and I think, I think there is this culture of in the professional wildlife management community that really discounts emotion or any sort of acceptance of the idea that animals have rights or feel pain, or and it's like it's somehow if you stand up in front of a game commission and you say, I think hunting's wrong, or trapping is cruel, there is tremendous pressure on the part of the agencies to dismiss that view, because it's such an existential threat to what they do, who they are, their identities. So, but I think we just have to keep doing it. We have to keep showing up and making it inconvenient that there are all these people out there that don't agree with that worldview. Yeah,
and just to follow up on that, I'm not going to do it justice. So Dawn, I'd welcome you to speak to this if you'd like. I can take you off mute if you raise your hand. But Dawn has put some comments in here speaking to the fact that the problem isn't necessarily status quo game commissioners. It's the system that has put them in place by and large, and we're not going to make substantive changes without changing some of the fundamental problems we're facing, like the funding issue. So I think we can make incremental progress with the system as set up as it is with better game commissioners, but I do think a more holistic restructuring or even dismantling is probably necessary for some of the real big changes that we want to see. And apologies if I didn't get that exactly right, Don. Zach asks, are there any substantial efforts opposing game ranches or operations that breed native wildlife for trophy hunting? I can only speak to this from New Mexico. I mean, it's basically celebrated. It's not explicit, but ranches that have big elk make a lot of money, and they get a lot of game tags, and they're treated with favor by our game department. I can't speak to other situations, but maybe someone else knows, or Kevin, you have some insight?
No.
I do think it's a symptom that really shows some of the fundamental problems and inconsistencies with the model, though, Zach, so thank you for asking. Don says, we also need a few more lawsuits in state court about state issues. Hard to fund, but needs to be done. I agree. Don, thanks. And Lindsay Laris, who happens to be my manager, says wildlife commissions, their composition, appointment terms, number of seats, etc., vary greatly by state. It's not always the case that every commissioner is a defender of the North American model. And I think that's a good point. I think we see it as being fairly ubiquitous throughout most agencies, but certainly there are commissioners that I've talked to, not necessarily here in New Mexico, that have a skeptical view of the North American model, or even don't know much about it. So that maybe is hopeful that some things are changing. Yeah, any other questions? Would anyone like to say their piece? Otherwise, I deeply appreciate everyone coming here and joining us. And just one more time, I will put this link here in the chat to sign up to get involved with some of our efforts, at least in Western states. And if you live in a state where we're not working, we can do our best to connect you with people who are involved in that work. So thank you all.
Thank you, everybody.